Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, my colleague Leah Ermarth from the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Leah is the research manager at BBG. Since 2009, she has managed the agency's global research program, ensuring its support of BBG strategies and programming priorities, including its efforts in Burma. Prior to joining the BBG, Ermarth worked for 15 years to provide research, evaluation, and planning services to federally funded programs in media, education, and economic development around the world, during which she oversaw more than 70 survey and other projects in countries across Africa and Asia. She holds an MA in Cultural Anthropology from the University of California, Davis. Please join me in welcoming Leah.
We at the BBG are really enjoying this series of research presentations. Myself, my colleagues, we spend, our days dealing with research like the type that you'll hear about today, and it is really unique and fun to be able to deliver it to, I think, a larger audience than we have, up till now. And so thanks for coming. We have more good ones planned in the future. I'm not an expert on Burma, but I have a lot of colleagues that are. And I have not heard anything from anyone other, really, than about what's going on in Burma. Surprise and cautious delight, I would say. I know delight isn't a word you hear much in these sort of fora, but I would say that is true to a person. And the delight continued earlier this week when Aung San Suu Kyi visited the BBG, both of its broadcasters in Burma, Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, gave formal interviews, but also informal conversations, which maybe you'll hear more about today, and struck a tone of real authenticity. So that was very exciting for us. And something that she did say, I know, in the VOA interview, she repeated this sense of cautious optimism and asserted how important it was to continue for international broadcasters to continue the work that they do and can do in Burma as it develops. In preparation for these remarks, I talked at some length with my colleague Doug Boynton, who is the Director of Program Placement for BBG, and he travels all over the world to help place our programs with affiliates on every continent. He's been to Burma a number of times this year and is going back actually in a couple of weeks. And I asked him what his thoughts were from these trips there. And he says, this is what he said, that he is truly welcomed with open arms when he goes there. That he feels the biggest, first of all, Voice of America, for those of you who don't know, has signed recently a deal to get programming content on state radio there, which is quite unprecedented. Now, I asked my colleague Doug, what are some threats that the BBG and its broadcasters face as we try to enter this really new and developing market? And he says, clearly, it looks like things are moving very fast in Burma, but the biggest threat to us is trying to move too fast. This is a developing market, and our presence there, our expansion there, is a process, and we have to treat it like a process. And that the government is particularly cautious when it comes to media. So we have placement there for some English learning programming, and we're going to take it step by step. Well, really, that's all I have to say about the general big picture, and I know you came here to hear the details about our new survey, which was fielded this late spring, so it's very recent data. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, first to Chris, to introduce them.
Our next speaker is my colleague Nicole Naurath, who is a Gallup World Poll Regional Director for Asia, and she's based in Bangkok. Nicole oversees research and data collection and social and economic analysis efforts in Asia. She monitors global and regional trends and shares results through presentations and articles. Her insights have appeared in the Jakarta Globe, the China Business Review, and the Yemen Times. Prior to joining Gallup, Nicole completed her master's degree in public policy from the University of Chicago. She also lived in China for several years. She earned a master's degree in international affairs and a bachelor's degree with a double major in political science and Spanish from Florida State University. Please join me in welcoming Nicole Naurath.
Good morning. I'd first like to take you through the details of the survey backgrounds and conditions in which it was conducted. So the target population of the survey was anybody in Burma who speaks Burmese, who's 15 years or older. We only offered the survey in the Burmese language. The total sample size was 3,000, and we conducted these interviews face-to-face in the respondent's home. The field period was from May 5th through June 20th of this year, and that was for 8.5 weeks. And we had a field team of 48 interviewers and supervisors and 2 independent quality control personnel. I attended the training in late April, and this is a picture at the culmination of the training with the fieldwork personnel. And this survey was conducted by the same local partner who has conducted all of the other previous surveys for this media study. The sample was nationally representative of Burma. So Burma has a total of 7 states and 7 regions. The states are where the ethnic minorities live. So Shan State is comprised of Shan people, and Rakhine State is where the Rakhine minority lives. And then there's 7 regions that are predominantly populated by the Burmese ethnicity. We went to 4 states and 7 regions. Chin and Kaya State we excluded based on their size. They're just so small and not populated very much that the cost of going there would really have increased the survey for just one sampling point. And in Kachin, there's an armed conflict against the government, so we felt it was not safe enough to go there. But in total, those 3 states only represent 4% of the population of Burma. And then out of those 4 states and 7 regions, there were 287 townships. That's the next lowest level of an administrative unit. And we selected 50 townships using the PPS method, probability proportional to size. And then from within those townships, we distributed wards and villages based on urban and rural population ratios. So it looks something like this. With Burma at the top, 7 states, 7 regions, we selected to only go to 4 states and 7 regions. And those have 287 townships. We selected 50. And of those, 76 sampling units were allocated to wards, that's urban, and 224 to villages. And each of those got 10 completed interviews for a total of 3,000 interviews. And this is the map of the country. Those red dots represent the townships. And so you can see the spread of where the interviewing took place. And these are the 3 states that we did not cover. Kachin in the north is where the armed conflict is going on, and Chin and Kaya based on their size. Once the interviewers then got to the village or ward where they would be completing interviews, they used a system to create an interval between the households, not just a standard every 3rd household, but to spread out the interviewing and create more heterogeneity. We decided to take the total number of households in the village, so let's say there's 70, and each had a target population of 10 completed interviews. We would divide 70 by 10 and get 7. So the interval between the main households was 7. They were moving every 7th household to complete an interview. And once they got to the household, they then had a method to randomly select the respondent. So they're not just taking the the available respondent, they're taking somebody randomly. They list the entire household from oldest to youngest and then use the last number of their questionnaire serial number to then randomly select who will be the respondent. And only that person can then complete the interview. This is a picture from the training, and the interviewers went through 4 rigorous days of training where they really spent a lot of time learning the questionnaire, which is quite complex, and all of the methodologies for household and respondent selection. It's difficult to collect data in Burma. There's not good infrastructure in a lot of places. Roads can be bad. Public transportation can be irregular. One supervisor told me that to get to the next village where her team was heading, the next bus was 1 week from then. So what did they do? They had to take a ride from somebody in the village who happened to be going in that direction. I mean, when you're on a tight deadline to complete data collection, you just can't wait around for a week. Also, when the supervisors get to the townships, it's customary but not necessary that they ask for permission to collect the interviews. And most times the village or township administrators say yes, but sometimes they don't, and that leads to delays or other possibly tense situations. Okay, now I'd like to move into the data, the results from the survey, and start with some general data on media use. So here we asked the respondents, which of the following devices do you have working in your household? Most people nationwide said that they have a radio, 64%, and slightly less people said a television at 57%. But then it drops off rather dramatically when we look at these other forms of communication. So mobile phones are just not very common in Burma right now. Only 17% said that they have a mobile phone, only 5% a landline phone, and only 3% a computer in their household. And if we look at that same question by urban and rural, we see quite a big divide on television ownership. 83% in urban areas have a television compared to just 46% in small towns or rural areas. And the same divide is present in mobile phones, landline telephones, and computers. But radio, we see more people in rural areas or small towns have a radio, 68% compared to 56% in urban areas. And overall in the country, radio is more commonly used than televisions. Here we asked respondents when was the last time that they listened to a radio program or watched television or used the internet, yesterday, within the last 7 days, or within the last 4 weeks. And we can see that listening to a radio is much more common. Let's say if we look at yesterday, 39% nationwide listened to a radio program versus 20% that watched television. And as you can see, it's just virtually non-existent that anybody was using the internet. And I think this is really because the infrastructure, the internet infrastructure there is just so poor. I've been there 3 times this year, and it doesn't matter where I am, if I'm in a 5-star hotel or at our local partner's office, it just doesn't matter where, you just have a really hard time connecting to the internet. You get dropped a lot. It's virtually non-existent in rural areas. The supervisors told me that if they go to a small village or a small town, that there might be one internet shop in that whole area, but there might be none. And they found a lot of respondents who'd never even heard of the internet. So radio is the most popular media, and it's seeing quite a shift recently. It used to be that medium wave or AM was more popular, but now FM is more popular. We asked respondents which of the following wave bands they've used in the last week to listen to the radio. In the 2009 survey, 10% had said FM, and that jumped rather dramatically to 42% in the 2010-2011 survey and has continued to rise in this recent survey, but medium wave dropped off dramatically. So state-owned radio has been the norm until very recently. So that's why you'll see in the top 3 radio stations that the first and third are state-owned radio services. But the second one is this new phenomenon that's sweeping the nation called Shui FM. It only was started, I think, in 2009 or 2010, and it's a wholly owned private radio station. That's very rare and very new in Burma. And their programming seems to be a lot different from what the state-owned radios are offering. It has a lot of pop music, which people really enjoy, but it also has a lot of talk shows about interests, or about topics of interest such as women's issues or career issues or children's programming. And it's on the air longer than any other radio station on a daily basis. It's from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. I guess radio stations there don't stay on 24 hours a day, but this one has the longest broadcasting time. And when I spoke with the supervisors who worked on this project, almost all of them told me that most of the areas that they went to throughout the country, Shui FM was available. Only in very few areas was it not. So even though radio is more commonly used than TV nationwide, weekly TV use is twice as common in the urban areas than it is in the rural areas. Because in rural areas, we saw that people don't have televisions as much, so it is quite common that they will have a communal viewing in certain places where they come together and they share a television and they watch together. So this is in Shan State. This is at a restaurant where I was eating, and we were the last people in the room, in the restaurant. And as we were finishing up our meal, people started filtering in, and they were taking chairs and putting it in front of the television, and they all sat down and started watching TV together. So when we look at TV, internet, or radio usage by certain demographics, we see some differences, but not in radio. Everyone, regardless of your educational attainment, people listen to the radio at the same level, roughly 65%. But when we look at television, as your education goes up, so too does the chance that you have watched television in the last week. So 66% of people with a secondary education watch TV versus 33%, half, with primary education or less. And we see that in internet as well, where 5% of the most educated people watched TV used the internet in the last week. But the TV markets are still largely dominated by state-owned outlets. Most all of those, and all three of the the three most popular ones are state-owned television stations. Mobile phones are not very common. In this question, we asked the respondents, do you yourself have a mobile phone or not? And nationwide, 14% said yes. But when we look at urban areas or those who are more educated, it goes up dramatically. So twice as many people, 28% have a mobile phone in urban areas versus 8% in the small towns or rural areas. And again, that goes up with education. And I think the reason for this is that the government has made it very difficult to obtain a SIM card, the little chip that goes into your card that's your phone number, and that's how you activate your phone. Until recently, those cost $2,000 US. I mean, that's priced way out of reach for all Burmese people. Within the last few years, it dropped to $1,500, and most recently, I think within the last year, it dropped to $250 US. So that's more affordable, but it's still not affordable for the majority of Burmese people. So the major developments in media use are the introduction of these new private radio stations, the FM radio stations, and a shift to FM listenership. Television is more common in the urban areas, but if development continues, and as it is, and we could see more rural areas getting TV and infrastructure for that. And the same is with the internet. As this development continues, we could see that internet use is on the rise. So now I'd like to turn it over to Chris.
Our next speaker is Betsy Henderson. Betsy is the Director of Research, Training, and Evaluation at Radio Free Asia, a government-funded private radio station under the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which began Tibetan language broadcasts in 1996. Ms. Henderson launched RFA's Audience Research Program for Tibet in 1998 and has commissioned regular qualitative and quantitative studies of Tibetan refugees and travelers since 2000, amongst a number of other topical research projects across the region. A former Associated Press reporter, she speaks fluent Mandarin and holds an MA in East Asian Studies from Stanford University. She also did graduate study at the University of Michigan, where work focused on research methodology and comparative politics. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Betsy Henderson.
So we at RFA are all abuzz, and I wanted to put in a little plug because we had such a fabulous meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi this week, and it's all available on YouTube, and it's all available on the www.rfa.org website. She gave us about half an hour off-the-cuff remarks, and they're all there, and it's pretty exciting. I've actually been doing research for Burma actually since 2000, and although the pace of change in the last couple of years has been extraordinary, and I can probably bring a little bit of perspective to some of the stuff that Nicole presented too, because it is such a changed environment. My portion is going to be talking about the use of media for news, because of course so much of the new media stuff that's coming in has been entertainment, music. So what does that mean for Burmese in terms of where they get their news? And once again, we find that as radio dominates the media, radio also dominates the use for news, much higher than television. But you'll see number 3 is friends and family. We find that is very common in more repressive areas, that people rely on word-of-mouth networks. However, this number is actually lower than we find elsewhere. And part of that has to do with the supply of shortwave radios into the country, providing information. Okay, when you break it down in terms of weekly use for news, you see the same thing Nicole saw, which was that TV use for news is actually much higher than in the urban areas, especially in Mandalay and Rangoon, which, and in rural areas, it's radio. Okay, so we think we know what news is. These are the 3 biggest stories that have been covered in the Western media relating to Burma in the last few years. The Saffron Revolution of 2007, the horrible cyclone Nargis, which devastated the country in 2008, and of course all the exciting developments of Aung San Suu Kyi's freedom from house arrest and election to the National Assembly. But is that what's news for Burmese? If you ask Burmese, what are the most serious problems facing Burma today, and you don't give them a list, and you just ask them, what's important, what do you think are problems today in your country? It's overwhelmingly things like economic hardship, health problems, housing problems, transportation difficulties. This is a poor country. And things like Aung San Suu Kyi and major affairs of the government, politics, are very, very low down on the priorities that people have. Interestingly, as you go up, the number 2 has to do with Chinese influence, which is something that I'm told by people who've been there on the ground recently is a palpable thing, that people are very much reacting to the strong role of China there. And we ask them in a prompted way, how interested are you in various things? And the overwhelming first choice is weather reports. Now, this has been true year after year after year, and actually when you saw what happened in the cyclone, Nargis, you can kind of understand why that would be a critically important thing. Religion, number 2. Again, this is the same year after year. Religion in Burma, obviously, is partly not simply religion, because the monks have such a are held in such high esteem and are seen as representing not just religious things, but also taking moral stands on things that are happening. Healthcare, not surprising, business and economy, sports, working all the way down. Politics, international affairs, really relatively low. Interestingly, science and technology is one that tends to be popular elsewhere, and it's not so popular in Burma at this point. They really have been rather cut off from some of the exciting high-tech developments. What was also interesting is when you broke this down by age cohorts, the rankings of topics was very similar across age cohorts. Young people were interested in weather more than they were interested in business. And the only thing that I found rather interesting was that young people as a group were less interested in everything. No, really, as you go across the age cohorts, as they got older, they got more interested. But the only areas where that was flipped were the arts, sports, education, and science and IT. Even though science and IT were relatively low for young people, they were more interested. Young people were more interested than others. So it's kind of fun to look at the data. There's so much good data in this survey. Okay, again, unprompted, what are your 3 most important sources for information? Completely unprompted. First 2 are not at all surprising. Radio's the top media. National radio, it's been around forever. It's MRTV, that's the national television station, been around forever. If you watch TV, that's what you're going to watch. But again, as Nicole highlighted, we see Shui FM. Again, a phenomenon. This next radio station is a relatively new one, but government-run, based in Naypyidaw, the new capital. Maiwadi TV is an Army-run television station. And then you also see MRTV4, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Shui FM and MRTV4 in a second. Go down from there, and you see, again, the international broadcasters are incredibly important to people. Unprompted, people will mention RFA, VOA, BBC, and DVB, which is Democratic Voice of Burma. Breaking down again by the largest city, what is striking in the largest city and in rural area, largest city is that you've got MRTV4 as the overwhelming top choice for news. And in rural areas, again, you see Shui FM as a very, very important source. Okay, Shui FM. So I want to talk just a little bit more about MRTV4 because these are really relatively new stations, and there have been a lot of developments recently. And it's interesting to me to see who some of the players are and how they got involved in this. So MRTV4 is a jointly operated thing with the government. It's not completely government, it's not completely private. It's jointly operated with a group called the Forever Group, and it was launched in 2004. Now has a 24-hour daily stream with a focus on entertainment, but recently they have expanded rapidly. It's called 4TV, and there's 4 information, and there's 4 comedy, and there's 4 education, and 4 sports. It's a conglomerate, and they also have free-to-air foreign news programs in the foreign languages, including CCTV, the Chinese. That was 2011. Fox News, Bloomberg, Deutsche Welle, which is the German, KBS from Korea, and Arirang, also from South Korea. So a little bit about the Forever Group. I think there's a group to watch. They started off doing computer graphics, and they have moved into, they've done tech training, e-education, public relations, sort of things that are sort of making things look slicker. And up here, you see U Win Ma. This is his latest venture, the Myanmar Media Development Center. And their public statement is that they are aimed at uplifting the proficiency of television crew members of the Ministry of Information so as to develop TV media technology with brilliant fine arts skills and to create the job opportunities in developing human resources in TV broadcasting field of private TV industry. So, but a lot of Westerners have jumped in on this. Deutsche Welle, our colleagues, the Germans, are very actively involved in this center, as is UNESCO. So, a little bit more. Nicole told you quite a bit about Shui FM, so I won't tell you too much, but I wanted to give you a sense of it. These are 3 of the top 10 pop stars in Burma today. It's less than 3 years old, and it is truly a phenomenon. 40% weekly reach. So how does a private station grow so fast and so big? You can see they're all over the place. Well, one of the ways it grows so popular is that it doesn't actually have that much competition. Until a couple years ago, you only had two FM stations in Burma, one in Mandalay and one in Rangoon. So there's not a whole lot out there. So, but another part of this is around the Shui Tan Luen Company, which is until recently best known for its mining, construction, trade, and agricultural ventures. They import vehicles, heavy machinery. They've facilitated business in ethnic regions, and they're reported to have a monopoly on tire distribution and coconut oil imports. So they're a big deal. And their chairman, Jiao Wen, has extremely close ties to military leaders. And the human rights community reports that until quite recently, he was on the banned list for visas to Europe because of his ties to the military. Now, of course, that's not the case. He also started a very interesting venture that has started to take off, and we're going to be watching it very closely, which is the Skynet direct-to-home satellite service. And there were some reports that there would be more free-to-air television coming from this group as well. So a little bit about Skynet TV. I think they're a very, very interesting group. They've got 48 channels. You have to pay for it, and you need a box on top of your television to get it. But they're starting to do things that others are not doing. For example, they were the sole domestic broadcaster who did Aung San Suu Kyi's coverage of her speeches in Europe. So that's quite interesting. They also have 4 channels. The Buddha channel, which I think will find an audience. The Up-to-Date channel, which is news and information, which is what covered Aung San Suu Kyi's trip, Myanmar International, and the newest one, and you'll forgive me, those of you who speak Burmese in the room, the Lutao channel, which is the National Assembly. That's a picture of the National Assembly, but I believe it's supposed to be along the lines of a C-SPAN type channel. So that's something that is very, very, very different and interesting. And Nicole reported to me when she was recently traveling in Shan State, a lot of people were watching Skynet TV. So we'll be watching that as well. So, question, how much do you trust the news you get from the following sources? People's default position is to say they trust things, but you can see that the international stations have a higher level of trust, marginally. But when you ask about a great deal, how much do you trust stations a great deal, I think you can see that there is a difference there. Compared to our last survey, which was done in December 2010, January 2011, there's actually been a drop in overall trust for the 3 domestic stations. I don't know how to interpret that. I think it might just be people being a little more honest in their answers. But there's no significant change in those considering domestic television stations very trustworthy. Furthermore, if you ask them directly, is official media more trustworthy now than 6 months ago? The majority say yes. There's sort of a caution among a group in the middle that say, it's about the same. But I think what's notable is nobody says it's much less trustworthy, and 6% say it's now much more trustworthy. So, again, something quite interesting to keep an eye on.
Our last presenter this morning is Mr. William Bill, the Director of Research for the International Broadcasting Bureau. Mr. Bill oversees all audience research activities for the Voice of America and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. He founded IBB's Audience Research Department and now leads a team of research professionals managing more than 70 projects a year worldwide. Prior to assuming this position, Mr. Bill served as Deputy Director of Affiliate Relations for Voice of America and as Deputy Policy Manager for the former U.S. Information Agency's WorldNet satellite TV service. He began his career as a Foreign Service officer, serving as Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Cameroon and as Deputy Public Affairs Officer in New Zealand. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the Fletcher School of Public Diplomacy and in survey methodology from University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Mr. William Bell.
Thanks, Chris. I thought it might be useful to take a few minutes at the end of this presentation to talk about the role of new media in Burma, both now and what it might portend for the future. As I think everybody in this room knows, satellite technology, digital technology have been enormously influential elsewhere in Asia, and it's worth thinking a bit about where they might take the media scene in Burma in the coming years. I'm going to go just slightly out of order on these slides and start here because this slide tells you basically what points I want to leave you with today. As we've already seen in some of the information presented by my colleagues, alternative media, mobile phones, internet, satellite, have been held back by a number of obstacles in Burma. Governmental control, that's less of a factor now than previously. Extreme cost, we heard about the cost of mobile phones and cards in Burma from Nicole, and infrastructural problems, as we've heard about as well. These are largely, to the extent they exist in Burma, urban phenomena at this point, but even if one looks, includes the urban markets and looks at the national picture, 80% or more of the population have no access to any of these technologies, unlike the case in most neighboring countries. And as a result, if one is looking at access to external sources of information, radio remains by far the main source of getting news, information, or for that matter, other content from outside of the country. But if we look at data from neighboring countries, and you'll see a little bit of that in the presentation here, you can see how quickly these things can change. And what happens in Burma, of course, is open to question, but the potential is obviously there, as we can see elsewhere. Now, here's just some trend data on mobile phone ownership in Burma over the past couple of years. You saw the figure on the right in Nicole's presentation. These are percentages of adults in Burma who say they personally have a mobile phone. And you can see a big jump between 2010 and 2012, but still at a very, very low level indeed. And given a $200 plus charge for SIM cards, that's not too surprising. And you can see how this shapes up in comparison to other countries in the region, where a SIM card costs only a couple of dollars or less in the countries, other countries shown here, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam. This is essentially the same measure, percentage of adults who have a mobile phone personally, and you can see how high that quickly gets, even in countries that are also at very low levels of economic development, but mobiles are much more easily accessible to the general population because of the much lower cost. So Burma has a long way to go to catch up with its neighbors, but this gives you some sense of the kinds of penetration levels that can be achieved with mobile in a more consumer-friendly environment, if you will. As Nicole pointed out earlier, the mobile phenomenon is basically urban at this point, and there it's reaching significant levels, although still a great deal lower than we see in other countries, but as a national phenomenon, still very, very small. And to the extent that people have mobiles, they're pretty limited in what they do with them. I'm sure many of you are aware of the wide variety of uses to which mobile phones are put in other countries around the world, and especially in Asia, use of video, access to the internet, mobile web, and so on, all sorts of things. In Burma, even those who have mobile phones use them basically for voice calls and SMS. There's very little use of mobile phones for other phenomena, as we see in other countries. So we have a long way to go, both in terms of overall ownership of mobile and the use of mobile for more advanced functions than just the basic voice and SMS capability that mobiles have. Turning then to internet use, as we've seen already, it's at very low levels, mostly in urban areas, but even there, less than 10% say they've used internet in the previous week. And so the extent that people have access to internet is almost exclusively in the internet cafe context. Having internet at home, at work, on a mobile phone is still a very, very rare phenomenon. So the base here is people who've used the internet in the previous month Actually, the number of weekly users, which is our standard base for this analysis, is too small to even examine in Burma. But among past month users, about 90% say they access the internet in a cafe, which has a lot of consequences, of course, for how one can use the web, the kind of information one can get from it, frequency, and so on. Internet use is mostly a young phenomenon. You can see it highest in the 15 to 24 age group here, but we're talking about small numbers throughout. We also asked those who've used the internet in the previous month where you go to get news and information on the internet to the extent that you do. And you can see Google and Facebook is starting to show up here, and then a couple of other Burmese sites as well. But this is fairly similar to what we see in a lot of countries in the region, although, again, the numbers are much smaller than elsewhere. Turning to satellite dishes, we see, again, mostly urban here, although some in smaller towns and communities with ownership of satellite dishes, but still only 6% at the national level who have satellite dishes. This is something we see on the BBG side as a potentially important vehicle for communication in Burma in the coming years. But the universe of satellite viewers has a long way to go. And you can see, looking at the trend data here, it's essentially flat for the past couple of years, 6% since 2009. Remains to be seen with the growth of phenomena like Skynet and others that have been mentioned here, how that'll grow in the future. Of course, that'll depend on cost, infrastructure, and other factors. Interesting to look at what people with satellite dishes actually watch. And this chart compares the past week viewership of various channels among households with satellite TV and then households who have TV but not satellite dishes. And you can see some differences that one might expect here, but what's particularly striking here is DVB, the Democratic Voice of Burma, a long-standing satellite TV program, which I believe is 24/7 or close to it. Is that correct? But you can see a very heavy viewership of that channel among those with satellite dishes, a third of that group, which is a small group, but a third of that group watching them on a weekly basis, which is a pretty good indication of perhaps where we in the BBG side can go as we develop our own satellite TV efforts, as we have both in VOA and at RFA. If we put together the access to satellite dishes and internet, which really would be the main means that people might have to get information or other content from outside of Burma, and create what we might call a connectedness index, anybody who has one of those or the other, you can see that on a national basis, 90% of the population still is unconnected in terms of being able to get information from outside the country. So this is still very isolated population in terms of their ability to get beyond the Burmese borders in accessing media content. A long way to go there. But you can see if we look at trends from Bangladesh, which is right next door, and I chose that because it's next door and because it's also at a very low level of economic development. And you can see what's happened there just in the past couple of years on access to some of these technologies. Personal use of mobile phones, personal access to mobile phones has increased by 20 percentage points in the past 3 years, and household ownership of cable TV has doubled in that time. So even in a very poor country, at a level of development probably not unlike that in Burma, these things can grow very fast given the right combination of political will, technological advancement, and consumer-oriented policies. So just a couple of concluding points to try to wrap up the entire presentation. As I think we've seen in these slides, the media environment remains quite underdeveloped and anchored in the old media, but we're seeing some stirrings of change. Radio remains the most used media for entertainment and news in Burma. We're seeing a significant expansion of domestic outlets in the past couple of years. Big growth of television in the urban markets. We've seen a limited number of private players that have gotten access to the market. There's obviously a desire for entertainment, news about religion, and utilitarian news. Given their history, it's understandable that Burmese are cautious about the level of trust and confidence they place in local media, but that's starting to change. We've seen a situation where web and mobile infrastructure is lagging far behind what it is in other Asian countries. and hence very, very low use, and we'll have to see how that goes over the next couple of years. The potential in mobile is high, as we see in neighboring countries, but it remains to be realized and is going to be dependent in part on cost issues, bringing access ability to the greater population. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We've got some time for some questions this morning. My colleagues have mics, so if you just let me know if you've got a question, and one of my colleagues will come over to you with a microphone. Okay.
I wanted to know, do we have figures showing the reach listenership for RFA and VOA?
Bill, Bill and Betsy, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, of course we do. I mean, RFA figures, VOA figures, do you have them? No,
Not in the presentation.
not in the presentation, but I have it in the report.
18%.
Is it 18%?
Give or take.
18, 20%?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the weekly numbers, they're 18, 19% for each of them. 18 and 19% weekly, and then the total annual reach is no, we don't have that. It's of course higher than that. I don't have the figure with me right now.
Bill, any comments?
No, that's correct. And these all three of the major international broadcasters in Burma have that's RFA, VOA, and BBC have had very large audiences over the years and continue to do so.
Okay, right here.
Hi. The most interesting slides I find is the question on what is news in Burma. I wonder if the base is the total sample.
Total sample. Yeah.
And do we have a crosstab of with, for example, the most frequent user of radio or TV?
That's an interesting question. I have not run that crosstab, but I'm sure we could.
VOA RFA focus heavily on political news,
of course,
serious stuff. So I want to know what this means to us.
We did ask VOA and RFA people about their level of interest in different things, and not surprisingly, their interest in political news was significantly higher than the population as a whole.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because, for example, over a third of people are not even regular users of radio or TV. Here, we have 63% people who last time used radio in the last week or so. So it'd be interesting to see those among those prolific users of radio or TV and what their interest would be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is certainly a data point. That
potential reach.
Joseph in the back there.
Chris Walker at the NED. I have a related question, and forgive me if I missed it, but can someone explain right now what the percentage of the audience is that's consuming news and information of political consequence, so things that are relevant to civic affairs or politics, from state media sources as opposed to any other sources?
You know, the focus was really on measuring the audience, but in terms of picking out what they're actually listening to or what they're actually watching on the domestic stations, that hasn't been a focus in this particular survey, but I agree, it's a really interesting question. I mean, that's why I was, when you see a station like Shui FM or MRTV4 take off, you immediately, my first question is always, what are they putting on? What are they doing? And I think for the most part, it is pretty tame stuff. I mean, it's entertainment, it's chat, it's, maybe some health stuff, non-controversial stuff for the most part, which is why I highlighted on Skynet things that I thought were different than what you might expect.
And I mention it in particular because some of the more adept authoritarian modernizers, and I can give examples, have been very good at creating modern, nimble media
Absolutely.
that keeps issues of political consequence marginalized. And I think this is
Sure,
something to
I
look at
mean-
on the front end in the Burmese case.
Yeah, people who are adept at this stuff their effort becomes more of a spin exercise, like let's make it look like news and give people enough of, I think the media would tend to focus on more kind of local, smaller things, which are the things that irritate people the most, and get away from the more overarching political stuff that they won't touch. I think that that's something that can happen as the media develops and wants to appear more open.
Thank you.
Joseph, I know we had one over here.
Did you get in your surveys any indication of news you can use? What was most popular? A little more specifically than you've outlined here. Any examples? News that you can use, listeners and viewers?
Well, I think that in a way, some of the questions that are being asked are more qualitative questions than survey type questions. I would say definitely if you look on the chart on what people are interested in, I would say health stuff is news you can use. How you can prevent diseases, how you can treat diseases. I would say that that's a very popular news you can use kind of topic. Some of the women's things, I guess you were saying, were things people thought were interesting. Family issues, relationship issues.
Those were mentioned in the context of what's being broadcast on Shui FM.
Right. Again, I think that's a very good question, and one that is probably best explored in a qualitative way.
Is there an increasing market for call-ins, for example?
Oh, I don't think they're there yet. I don't think they're there yet, but I think that it would be very attractive to people.
Any other questions? Okay, we got you in and out in 1 hour this morning. I'd like to highlight a couple upcoming events. We've got Indonesia on October 16th, and on November 8th we'll have a real good session on Russia. Let's give our panelists one final round of applause.